This is a historical perspective on non-elite access to classics in Britain. Last year, with Dr. Henry Stead of St Andrews University, and with much input from Professor Cartledge's close reading of the penultimate draft, I published a book entitled A People's History of Classics, Class and Greco-Roman Antiquity in Britain and Ireland 1689 to 1939. The aim was to document the complex and varied ways in which non-elite people in these islands accessed ancient Greece and Rome and their languages from the Glorious Revolution, at about the time that the subject area we know as classics was first invented, until the run-up to the Butler Education Act 1944. And the books also formed the intellectual backdrop to the campaign I set up with Dr. Arlene Holmes Henderson, ACE, or Advocating Classics Education, which campaigns for the expansion of the provision of classical subjects in British state secondary education. And today I identified 10 ways in which the admirable project of Classics for All, improving access to classical subjects in education so it's available to all our youngsters, can perhaps learn from and be encouraged by the past. So first, there's always been a great deal of interest in the ancient Greeks and Romans across the social spectrum. Our research in remote archives often uncovered an encounter with the ancient world which took our breath away. One was finding the lesson preparation of Isabel Dawson, a primary school teacher in the tiny town of Buckie on the Moray Firth, who just before World War I was teaching her little charges the Greek alphabet alongside the 3 R's and domestic science. And this book asks how workers gained access to classical texts, ideas and materials, and how the contact benefited them, affected their lives and their attitudes. Now, the idea that classics is an elite subject has always been and remains pervasive, but it's simply not true. Just because some people and institutions have used it to exclude the majority of the population and to emphasise socio-political hierarchies does not mean that it's inherently elitist, nor that it can't be used in manifold progressive causes, from abolition of slavery to democratic reform, women's suffrage, gay rights and utopian thinking. Our book refutes wholesale the argument that classical education must be intrinsically elitist or reactionary. It has been the curriculum of empire, but it can be the curriculum of liberation. So we emphasise the historical instrumentality of the legacy of Greece and Rome in progressive and enlightened causes, both personal and political. And second, there's no logical basis to the idea that there's a conflict or contradiction between approaching the Greco-Roman world through learning the actual ancient languages or through translations or material culture. Criticism of courses that approach the ancient world in translation serve only to impede mass access and cement ancient and unhelpful prejudices. Thomas Jefferson, who found the idea of the pursuit of happiness in Aristotle, wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia that the one real goal of education was equipping people to defend their freedom. And he argued that history, which must include for him ancient history, was the subject which made citizens so equipped. And to stay free requires also comparison of constitutions, fearlessness about change, critical, lateral, relativist thinking across time and cultures. The ancient Mediterranean world offers an ideal context for the development of these forms of intellectual understanding and skills. And Matthew Arnold, who'd observed hundreds of schools in France and Germany, as well as in Britain, as one of Her Majesty's inspectors, actually criticised the excessive linguistic emphasis of contemporary classics, especially teaching, in a talk he gave at Eton while advocating the importance of studying the entirety of Greco-Roman civilization. He said that an overly narrow linguistic emphasis actually destroys the precious facility to conceive that Greco-Roman world, which he said was so mighty a factor in our own world, our own life, as a whole of which we can trace the sequence and the sense and the connection with ourselves. So we were actually delighted to discover a marvellous English prose essay published in 1700. It's the preface to an anonymous translation from ancient Greek, Lucian's Charon. The dialogue itself is one of Lucian's most elegant little dramas. Charon ascends to the world of the living, and he's taken on a whistle-stop tour of archaic civilization by Hermes. And this 1700 preface is an original dialogue between two men on the theme of studying classical literature in translation. The arguments put forward by Philenor are diverse and cogent. He points out that translation of Greek masterpieces was good enough for the Romans, since Cicero, Ennius, Pacuvius and so on had all been translators. On the contrary, says Philenor, we should think that nothing in the world has a greater tendency to its advancement. Those rich treasures of knowledge and learning amongst the ancients are no longer now locked up in unintelligible words. Translating texts by the ancient Greeks and Romans into English, he says, has to our country brought all they writ and all they thought. Men may now familiarly converse with the wits of Greece and Rome. For now every man may hear Plutarch, Tully, Homer, Virgil, Theocritus, Horace, Ovid and innumerable others speaking in his own tongue the wonderful works of God and nature, the admirable productions of wit and fancy, and whatever else may yield a grateful satisfaction to noble and ingenious minds. Moreover, enjoying ancient authors in one's mother tongue encourages people to study Greek and Latin. One of the translator's aims, he says, has been to excite the desire of readers to improve their knowledge of the ancient languages, especially in those who have the opportunity, leisure and financial support to do so. And I, like many other universities, can absolutely vouch for the truth of this. Our students who arrive excited by reading Greek drama or Virgil or Arrian or Livy or Suetonius in classical civilization and ancient history courses soon catch up out of sheer enthusiasm with those lucky enough to have had access to the ancient language, which usually is only because they attended private school. So many of the individuals we studied started relatively late but learned incredible speed. And that helped us to understand that it's never too late to get the classics bug. And in looking at the history of reading in translation, we came to acknowledge the peerless contribution made by Dryden's Virgil and especially Pope's Homer, as well as other cheap translations, to the availability of ancient authors to all. Pope's translations, which were so often reprinted that they became available for tiny sums on the second-hand book market, brought Homer to a far larger audience, including workers and women, than had ever had the opportunity to learn Greek. Take Esther Easton, a Jedburgh gardener's wife, visited by Robert Burns in 1787. He recorded she was a very remarkable woman for reciting poetry of all kinds. She can repeat almost everything she's ever read, particularly Pope's Homer from end to end. In short, is a woman of extraordinary abilities. And Pope's Homer captured the childhood imagination of another Scot, Hugh Miller. And now he grew up to become a world-famous geologist. But even as a boy, he saw the Iliad as incomparable literature and reminds us how pleasure can attract young people towards classics if they're not put off. He wrote in My Schools and Schoolmasters in 1854 that he'd learned early, no other writer can cast a javelin with the force of Homer. The missiles went whizzing athwart his pages, and I could see the momentary gleam of steel ere it buried itself deep in brass and bull hide. Now, third, we also came to understand the importance of publishers with a social conscience and a commitment to mass education. After many hours winding yarn for a Leicester cardigan jacket weaver, Tom Barclay, who was the son of Irish immigrants, that his dad was a rag and bone man, revelled in his collection of second-hand, often tattered books kept in a clothes basket. He scoured market schools for discarded school books and popular educational journals. Many a studious youth, he reflects, has blessed another publisher, namely Cassell, for bringing out the popular educator. And John Cassell himself joked that the country is positively threatened with cooks and housemaids and nurses and footmen, grooms, mechanics and peasants that will actually have more information, intelligence, piety and morality than the kings, lords, clergy and gentry of the olden time. Now, Cassell began life himself as a labourer in a Manchester cotton mill and velveteen factory, but he was apprenticed at 16 to a joiner in Salford. But at 20 he walked out away from the poverty of his childhood to London, married, opened a tea and coffee business. And he then ventured into the world of educational publishing for the purpose, as he wrote in 1851, of issuing a series of publications calculated to advance the moral and social well-being of the working classes. In 1852 he launched his famous Popular Educator, which immediately became the staple reading of the working class autodidact. And Cassell's alumni included the future Prime Minister David Lloyd George and the workhouse boy who, with the help of a Wesleyan night school, became Oxford Professor of Comparative Philology, Joseph Wright. Thomas Burt, a Northumberland miner, worked as a trapper at Haswell Pit, but then became, much later, councillor to King Edward VII and father of the House of Commons. And Burt considered Cassell's publication the chief handbook in my self-instruction. He remembers sitting at the end of the table, armed with the Popular Educator and a Latin dictionary, while with slate and pencil, he wrote, I translated as best I could the Latin lessons into English and the English into Latin. And these Latin words, with their English meanings, committed to memory. Now, the philological brains behind Cassell's entrepreneurial brawn belonged to the Reverend John Relly Beard. A devout Unitarian minister, he opened a school in Salford and later a very important college for training Unitarian teachers and preachers. He was a crucial force behind the movement for popular education. And by the time he contributed the weekly lessons in Latin, Greek and English literature to Cassell's Popular Educator, Beard had already produced Latin Made Easy in 1848 and demonstrated his political radicalism by publishing a biography of the leader of the Haiti slave rebellion, Toussaint Louverture. Now, in his Greek lessons, Beard writes, my purpose is to simplify the study of Greek so as to throw open to all who are earnest in the great work of self-culture. Nor need any industrious person of ordinary capacity despair of acquiring skill to read the New Testament, and, if he pleases and will persevere, he may then go on to an intimate acquaintance with Xenophon, Demosthenes, Thucydides, Homer, and the other Greek classics. So great inexpensive translation series played crucial roles as well, and they included Henry Bone's famed classical library of Greek and Roman classics, established in 1848, and that consisted of 79 classical titles. Then Cassell & Co. launched the National Library, edited by the philanthropic UCL Professor of English Henry Morley. These were read, for example, by one Thomas Jones, an iron worker who could just about afford them, and smuggled these slim volumes into his iron plants, and he eventually became one of the most powerful civil servants in London, Deputy Secretary under Lloyd George, and he was considered indispensable by 3 subsequent Prime Ministers. There were even cheaper initiatives, such as the 6-penny Plutarch's Lives, and that was edited by Ward, Lock & Co. in 1885, and the very thin volumes of William Thomas Steed's Books for the Bairns, a series launched in 1896 with Aesop's Fables. He was the son of an underemployed iron foundry worker and later an iron moulder himself. But Joseph Stamper remembers reading Stead's pamphlets in St Helens, Lancashire, especially stories from ancient Rome, which summarises tales from the Aeneid and Livy. He also read Homer, Pliny's Letters and Aesop fables. And it was Joseph Mallaby Dent's Everyman Library, however, which from 1906 took cheap reprint publishing and cross-class access to the Greco-Roman classics to another level altogether. Everyman published 1,000 titles in its first 50 years, and 46 are classical. They include most of the standard works of Greek and Roman philosophy, prose and history, from Marcus Aurelius, that was actually the first classical text released, through the dramas of Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides and Aristophanes, to the epics of Homer and Virgil. Dent was the son of a Darlington painter-decorator, and he wanted to run away with the travelling theatre, but after joining a mutual improvement society, caught the literature bug. Raised in a working-class house with 11 siblings and educated by Wesleyan Methodists, Dent used to sneak out to the old barn theatre in Darlington, where his threepenny coin bought him a gallery seat and transportation from the daily grind. Theatre broadened his cultural horizons. He was particularly enthralled by James Sheridan Knowles's Virginius, for, he wrote, it had a Roman setting and took me far away from things mundane into a world of imagination which has haunted me ever since. Now, fourth, our research has taught us never to underestimate anyone's ability to understand complicated authors. Dent's editor was Ernest Rhys, who began his life as a coal viewer at Langley Park, County Durham. And in the few years before he moved to London to live by his pen, he sought to enrich the leisure conditions and intellectual lives of his co-workers. To the consternation of his Conservative line manager, who considered mine workers to be interested only in drinking and gambling, he managed to establish a library in a derelict workers' cottage, and Plato's Republic was the first thing on the inaugural reading list. Fifth, it became clear that getting access to the ancient world in any serious and committed academic way required, as well as good luck and hard work, help from the more financially fortunate. 2 years into his apprenticeship to a Buckingham tailor, Robert Hill, intrigued by Latin epitaphs in his churchyard, acquired 2 beaten-up old language textbooks of Latin. But it was only the patronage of a kind teacher at Buckingham Free School, and then of 2 gentlemanly employees who lent him books and swapped Greek for fishing lessons. And lastly, of Joseph Spence, a scholarly clergyman and patron of underprivileged poets. It was only then that he got the education he needed to work as a school teacher, which is what he wanted. And Thomas Rudimen, the near starving son of a Catholic Aberdeenshire tenant farmer, had to run away from home to compete and win a bursary at what was then King's College, Aberdeen. But it was only by a completely random encounter with a philanthropic physician, Archibald Pitcairn, did he gain a post at the Advocates' Library at Edinburgh, and then publish his exceptional bestseller, The Rudiments of the Latin Tongue, in 1714, which, crucially, explained things in English. And the 2 great Georgian professors of Greek at Edinburgh, Andrew Dalzell and George Dunbar, were a carpenter's son spotted and financed by a friendly laird, and a gardener spotted by Dalzell himself once he'd made it, respectively. Free library provision made a huge difference to opportunity as well. That remarkable civil servant Thomas Jones, who we've met, was lucky enough to be born into the South Wales iron town of Rhymney, where in 1858 the Iron Company paid £3,000 to provide the town with a national school, a library and a reading room. And amongst the very first library loans were translations of Plutarch's Lives and Josephus' Jewish Wars, as well as Gibbon's Decline and Fall. Sixth, individuals can make a difference. Individuals like Henry Brougham, founder of the Crucial Society for the Diffusion of Crucial Knowledge, and they've often made a huge personal contribution by work, but so has financial giving by individual philanthropists in support of classical education. A great example is the celebrated Dick bequest established by James Dick, a shoemaker's son, who yet made a fortune and in 1828 left £114,000 to train school teachers in the shires of Aberdeen, Bamford and Moray. And that important bequest strengthened the connection between the Eastern Parish schools and the universities of Aberdeen. Another great example is the will left by Edmund Harris, which allowed the Preston Corporation to set up a library, museum and art gallery absolutely suffused with classical materials and art to honour the memory of Harris's father, a self-made man. Seventh, we found plenty of evidence for the practical skills that the classics gave to people, not only inspiring their imaginations and cultural literacy, but citizenship skills, the power of argumentation and verbal expression, and just two examples make this clear. One is that the rhetorical training of large numbers of Methodists was based on classical oratory. At Oxford, John Wesley had studied Ciceronian oratory, but he was convinced that his non-ordained male and female preachers, many of whom had hardly any previous education, would benefit from hands-on training in the principles of classical rhetoric. He enthusiastically supervised the training himself, and he told them all to read between 6 and 8 hours a day and recommended that they study not only scripture, but Hebrew, Greek, philosophy, secular history, ancient history and science. He insisted that they learn from the Dutch scholar and theologian Gerard Vossius's introduction to Aristotelian rhetoric, the fundamental classical rhetorical precepts of deportment, appropriateness, sublimity, force, relevance and brevity. And the curriculum of the miners and preachers' children, who he educated at Kingswood, the school he founded near Bristol, also included ancient Greek and, in their case, Latin. He modelled their education after his own, claiming, "Whoever carefully goes through this course will be a better scholar than 9 in 10 of the graduates of Oxford or Cambridge." The other example of skills is that there was an epidemic of plays on Caractacus, inspired by Tacitus, and performed in Edwardian Welsh schools in both Welsh and English. And the headmaster of Abergele School reports that the initiative had increased not only interest in history and the ancient history of Wales, but it also enhanced the standard of intelligence in everyone. There's a new zest, not only in history but in other studies. It's as though the children's outlook had been suddenly broadened and their intelligent appreciation of facts quickened. The 8th point is that government LEA policy helps, but we need to lobby today from government in the forms of legislation for educational policy and funding. The comparative richness of Scottish classical education historically went right back to the Reformation, because that's when Protestant reformers identified children's education, free education, as the instrument that could produce literate but godly citizens. And they tried to bring in a national school system centrally administered by the Kirk, masterminded by John Knox. Some working poor could now enter the schools and even learn Latin, occasionally Greek, since there were systems in place for their fees to be covered. And much later, Elizabeth Lip of Morisha was the very first girl from the northeast of Scotland to train as a certified teacher, but that was only as a beneficiary of the landmark Education Scotland Act of 1872. And there she studied subjects including Latin, and Caesar and Virgil were her set texts, and Alexander Adams' Roman antiquities. She was an innkeeper's daughter, but nevertheless got employment as a teacher in a highly respected Stornoway school after achieving the coveted Certificate of Competence. And finally, someone I'm researching now is the Victorian Edwardian educationalist Frederick Gould, and he's author of The Children's Plutarch. And he succeeded in getting classical myth and history a compulsory place in the London School Board's primary curriculum. 9th, universities can and should step up. Extramural and extension schemes from the late 19th century in Cambridge, London, Leeds, Oxford and elsewhere as well, outstandingly Durham, were very successful. John Guy was a sacristan miner who studied Greek on a course set up by the NUM. And he took classes with the Durham Board of Extramural Studies. At Durham too, a Yorkshire miner's daughter called Barbara Taylor got a scholarship to read Latin at university. We need to foster much more joined up thinking between primary, secondary and tertiary institutions. And my last point, 10, is this. Alongside our inspiring stories, our research into memoirs confronted us with the terrible pain that being deprived of access to culture and classics inflicted on some working men. The Chartist poet Samuel Bamford believed this deprivation had arrested his intellectual development. A poet, a campaigner for universal suffrage, he identified the very moment at which he was formally excluded from learning classical languages as the opposite of a turning point. It was the event that determined he would stay labouring class forever. He'd come top of the senior English class, and that was at his local parish school, would normally have expected to advance into the Latin class, but his father refused to allow it. Ben Tillett, trade unionist and former MP, now over 70 years old, recalled in the 1830s working in the London docks in the late 19th century. He'd realised the need to acquire conventional education when the harshness of life in the East End persuaded him to become a Labour evangelist, but he felt very ill-equipped. Before I could enter upon that stage of my career, he wrote, there were areas of education to make up. I had much to learn as well as much to forget. Because a native of Bristol, Tillett had been labouring in a brickyard at the age of 8. And one paragraph of his memoirs starkly evokes the exhaustion induced by work. As a docker, I tried to save money. I starved to buy books. I was struggling to learn Latin. I was even trying to study Greek, lending my head, my aching body, to the task of my day's work on the dockside or on the tea warehouse where I was employed. And that meant carrying tons on my back up and down flights of stairs. If I have one grouch against the world rather than any other, the lack of opportunity for acquiring that kind of education in my early days is that one big grouch. So the British working classes were almost universally excluded from institutionalised classics and from study of ancient languages, but a few did overcome the obstacles. Many more engaged with the ancient Greeks and Romans in myriad creative ways. The classical world aided their careers, expanded their horizons, improved their rhetoric, informed their politics, alleviated their boredom, inspired them to read, write, paint, draw, sculpt, act, perform, teach, publish, organise trade unions, join debating societies, read the Gospels in the original, and question the existence of God altogether. They used classics to prove their intellectual calibre, to express their plight. They also used it to undermine the authority of the classes that had oppressed them and to entertain themselves during leisure hours. The heroes of British people's classics that we have met were gardeners, stonemasons, circus acrobats, factory operatives, engravers, cutlers, domestic servants, brewers, weavers, tramps, beggars, prisoners, thieves, inmates of mental hospitals, plasterers, painter-decorators, cabin boys, milkmaids, washerwomen, wool sorters, drummers, butchers, grocers, mechanics, grooms, carpenters, errand boys, tailors, pill sellers, janitors, porters, dockers, hatters, fishermen, sailor, comb makers, bakers, bricklayers, navvies, shepherds, threshers and grave diggers. And I think they deserve to be given honoured places in the gallery of classics for all because they struggled so hard to get access to the ancient world. But they also offer us a glorious new ancestral backstory for subject matter that still stands in some need of being made more accessible. Thank you very much.